Hey everyone, Brett has a question for me.
My name is Brett Carpenter. I'm calling from Querétaro, Mexico. I was just wondering what verse the pretribbers use to show that the rapture will be at the beginning of Daniel's 70th week and not say 10 years before the 70th week or 100 years before or 1,000 years before. They argue that Jesus' return or the rapture is imminent. So could his rapture occur and then the 70th week of Daniel not start, say, 500 years later?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. This is a good question. And first of all, there is no actual verse. If you're, if you look in pre-trib literature for an actual verse that supports this notion that the rapture happens and then the 70th week of Daniel happens after that, you're not going to find that. In fact, pretribs themselves admit that. John Walvoord, one of the most noted pretrib exponents, admits or has admitted that pretribulationism is not based on any explicit evidence in the Bible, i.e., go to chapter and verse. Instead, he says that it's based on an inference. And basing your theology on inferences is not a bad thing. In fact, I would argue that most of our theology is based on inference from Scripture. And so, for example, when Jesus says, says that he forgives someone of their sin, right? And the Pharisees say, well, only God can forgive sin. Well, what's the inference, right? Well, Jesus is functioning in a divine capacity there. Nothing wrong with theological inference. The problem is that, the question we should be asking is the inference valid? Is it based on valid premises? And for pre-tribulationists, that's the problem that they have, is they may have a valid inference, but it's not based on valid premises. And what premises am I talking about? Well, this is basically the main argument of pre-tribulationism, and that is they would say that the prophecy in Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel, you have the first 69 weeks have already happened, which, pre-wrath, we would agree that's the case. And we both would agree that the future 70th week of Daniel is still in the future. The last 70th week of Daniel, the last 7-year period, is still in the future. But they would say that the first 69 weeks, here's the argument, because the church did not experience the first 69 weeks of Daniel, therefore the church cannot be part of the last 7-year period. That last 7-year period is not applicable to the church. Therefore, the church will be raptured just before the 7th week of Daniel occurs. So they would say, okay, there's, and by the way, some pre-tribulationists do believe in that there is that there can be a gap between the rapture and the beginning of the 7-year period. Maybe we don't know. They hypothetically or theoretically they would say that it could be maybe a year, it could be 10 years, it could be 100 years, but the vast majority of pre-trib teachers would say no. It's safe to assume that when the rapture happens, immediately the 7-year period will begin. Okay, so again, going back to their argument that they would say supports the pre-trib rapture, they would say that the church cannot be part of the 7-year period, and therefore it must be raptured before the 7-year period. Okay? Now, here's the problem. And the problem is the assumption that because the church was not part of the first 69 weeks, therefore it can't exist before the 7th week of Daniel. Well, the problem is that the church didn't exist during the first 69 weeks. But it does exist now. And therefore, it can enter into the 7th week of Daniel. So logically, they're flawed. And on a biblical level, they're flawed as well, because they're under this notion that the 7th week of Daniel is, the 7th week of Daniel is it's a Jewish week. It's not. It's actually more of a Gentile week. It's only after the fulfillment of the 70th week of Daniel does it really become a Jewish phenomenon in that all salvation, or all Israel will be saved. All one has to do is go back to Daniel 9 and see that. It's only until the 70 weeks, i.e. Each week is a 7-year period, the 490 years, only until that's fulfilled will these prophecies of Israel come to fruition. Not during the 70th week of Daniel, but only after it. But that being said, their biggest problem is that when you look at Matthew 24, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the book of Revelation, you see that the church is going to be involved in the 70th week of Daniel. There's this is a myth that the rapture will happen before the 70th week of Daniel. Nowhere in Scripture is this inference taught, or of course explicitly. Instead, I wrote a whole book on this, Antichrist Before the Day of the Lord, showing that the church will indeed encounter the Antichrist persecution within the 7-year period before Christ returns. Now, of course, God does. Now, this is another thing I should have mentioned as well, and that is the pre-trib assumption that God doesn't work with Israel and the church at the same time. And therefore, you can't have God working with the church and Israel during the 7th week of Daniel. Once again, that's a flawed view of their system. They're more the traditional dispensational system that would argue that. The problem with that is God worked. What was AD 70? It was a judgment on Israel. Well, that was during the church age. Right now, Paul says that God is working with Israel. He's making them jealous by saving Gentiles. Okay, so God does work with Israel and the church at the same time in the past, right now, and He will in the future. Look at Revelation 7. What a beautiful picture of God working with both Israel and the church at the same time during the 70th week of Daniel. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, it's more of a Gentile week or Gentile period of time in that God is, He's judging the Gentiles in the day of the Lord's wrath, and part of it, He's working with, again, continuing to work with the church. And of course, God, He does work with a remnant of Israel, the 144,000, Revelation 7, 144,000 Jews who are protected, but they will be saved after the 7-year period. So I hope this helps, Brett. Great question. And again, just to sum this up, is they don't look for any explicit passage that teaches this notion, although they'll try to bring in other passages to support a pre-trib rapture, indeed. But as far as the thesis that the rapture will occur immediately before the 7-year period, that's based on an inference, and it's based on it's an invalid inference because it's based on flawed premises.